Okay, let's talk about why I moved the wastegate. So it was basically to fight some back pressure. So the way the exhaust system in the car is routed is I've got the headers coming into a collector, and the outlet of that collector is 2.5 inch. Same thing on both sides. I'm not going to repeat my awesome drawing of the exhaust tubes, but anyway, 2.5 both sides, right? And then that comes back down the side of the transmission like a typical dual system. And then at the very end of the transmission where the drive shaft comes out, another awesome sketch. Oh my God, look at that. Wow. Okay, so after that, they come together into a Y pipe. And that Y pipe necks those down to a 3.5 inch. So far, pretty good flowing exhaust system. But then what happens is out of that 3.5, I neck down to a 2.5 again, but just a single 2.5. And then that, in the old system, went behind the differential, split into two pipes, one going to the turbine and one going to the wastegate with the dump. Okay, so what that meant is that all the flow for the turbine and the wastegate, all of the exhaust flow was going through this 2.5 inch section right here, which in the car is, let's say, 3 feet long roughly, or a meter roughly. Okay, so 600 horsepower through that kind of area, that's a lot of flow. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind with turbos is that by far the biggest pressure drop in this whole system, even from here, call it point A, all the way over to here, point B at the inlet of the turbo, even with a restrictive system, let's say that's going to be, I don't know, 3 psi to 6 psi. And for a naturally aspirated engine, that would be huge. By far, the biggest pressure drop in the system is going to be from point B at the inlet of the turbine to point C at the outlet of the turbine. That's where all the energy is coming from to drive the compressor. It's coming from flow through the turbine, the pressure drop through the turbine, and heat through the turbine. So if you have, let's say, a 15 psi, where you're running 15 psi of boost, right? It's not unusual to have what's called, if you look at what's called the pressure ratio, where the pressure ratio is equal to the outlet pressure at the manifold divided by, I ran off the page, inlet pressure. And that, in a decent setup, can be around as high as 2-to-1. And in some OEM setups, since people get so upset about slow spooling turbos in OEM applications, they could push that up to 3-to-1, right? So what that means is if you're running 15 psi of boost, you could have 45 psi of back pressure at point B in your turbine. So you've got 45 psi coming in, and then as it comes out through the turbine, eventually it expands to atmosphere, and you've got about 15 psi. So that's a lot of back pressure. People say you get free energy from your exhaust flow, but you don't. The engine is having to compress that flow going into the exhaust system to give you all of that pressure and energy that your turbine is harvesting to drive the compressor wheel. So let's say I got 6 psi pressure drop in my system because I've got a nasty flow restriction. This turbo is probably running at about 2 to 1, so that means I still have 30 psi of pressure drop from B to C through the turbine. So to put this in perspective, the pressure drop in the system, yeah, it's significant, but by far the biggest pressure drop in your system is going to be across the turbine, which is why you can get away with smaller exhaust pipes in turbo systems. And in fact, it actually helps you a little bit because this is less volume to compress. You also have less surface area on the pipe to shed heat if you're using a rear mount system like I am. So it's actually helpful not to run a huge exhaust. But, still, this is a lot of flow through this section, and I would say that by far most of the pressure drop in the system is going to be in this short little section right here between where it necks down from 3.5 inches here to 2.5 inches here. So I had a long conversation with someone at AGP Turbo. Great conversation. We must have been on the phone for an hour. Excellent customer service about what was going on. And he had a suggestion about how to deal with this right here that after scratching my head a little bit, I figured out that was genius. Okay, so I'm going to redraw this because this is getting a little messy. So I'm just going to draw the Y-pipe section. And then that runs aft. So what he had suggested was to cut down on the amount of the flow that's going through this small section of the pipe here, move the wastegate forward. Now, he was originally suggesting that I put it all the way up at the header collectors, which, that would be cool, but that gives me a lot of issues with how to route those dump pipes, which would be 2 of them, all the way out of the back of the car, because one of the organizations I race with, NASA, all of your exhaust has to dump out behind the driver. They don't want you asphyxiating and running your wall into a concrete barrier on the track. Go figure. Those guys are no fun. So I said, well, wait a minute. What I can do then is I can tap off of this section right here, crudely drawn, where it necks down into this funnel, and then move my wastegate over here and then have my dump pipe. So now what that means is all I'm running back here to the turbine is only the flow that's going to go through the turbine, right? So another thing to remember is this is all system dependent. I don't even know if this is a rule of thumb, but based on the calculations I ran in MatchBot for the Borg-Warner Turbo, I'm going to be adding to this system the flow through the wastegate, which MatchBot will tell you if you garbage in, garbage out. You got to get all your parameters correct. For this is going to be about 50%. So what that means is when I hit, call it 14 psi, and I'm flowing 600 plus brake horsepower of exhaust flow through this system, half of it is going through the wastegate, 50%, and half is going through the turbine. So I can keep this 2.5 inch section here, which I really want to keep because one of the things about Miatas is when you try and run exhaust past the differential, and I guess it's this way on a lot of cars, it's very, very tight in there. It's almost hitting the subframe in 2 spots and almost hitting the left side axle in another spot. I don't want to go to a 3 inch or anything like that. And I really don't need to if I do this, because now where the system necks down from the 3.5 to the 2.5, I'm splitting my flow 50% is going through the wastegate, and I'm just going to dump that out of the side of the car. And 50% is going through the turbine. So now I've halved the exhaust flow that's going through here. And, if you want to think about it in terms of an NA, that basically means I'm running a 600 horsepower engine through 2.5-inch dual exhaust, which, that's pushing things. But again, in a turbo engine, it's not a big deal because remember, by far the biggest pressure drop in the system is through the turbine, where all that exhaust energy is being extracted to drive the compressor wheel, which is providing your boost to your engine. All right, so that's why we moved the wastegate. I think it's a great idea. It was very little effort, no really significant downsides. It should work great. So I just did it, and we're going to see how it works out. So just to reiterate what I was talking about doing the diagram there, here are my two 2.5-inch pipes coming in from the headers up there, engine's over there, coming in here to this Y collector, which terminates in a 3.5-inch exhaust. And then right here is where it necks down with that funnel adapter from 3.5-inch here to 2.5-inch here, which runs to the back of the car. So what I did is I took the wastegate plumbing and the wastegate from the back of the car and grafted it into here. Again, you don't want to just tee this thing in. You want to have a gradual transition because you want to encourage the flow to go into your wastegate. Otherwise, you can get boost creep because the flow doesn't want to do a 90. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong way. The flow doesn't want to do a 90. It wants to gradually turn up into here. So that's just a thing you can do to prevent boost creep. All right, and so then now this 2.5, which is only flowing half of our flow instead of all of the flow like it was when the wastegate was in the back, I can keep my 2.5-inch pipe because, as you can see, man, it is a tight fit. I'm barely clearing the subframe here, barely clearing it there. Maybe not even a finger width of clearance between the exhaust and the drive shaft. And I can't move this stuff. It's got to be there, obviously. So I keep my 2.5-inch pipe, I run it back, and then when the new turbo comes in, it's going to be going right there. But the only flow that's going through this section of the pipe is what goes through the turbine. And again, over here in the system where I'm still at the 3.5-inch is where my flow is getting split. 50% at red line at 600 plus brake horsepower of exhaust flow. Half of it's going to go through here, and half of it is going to go through here because the wastegate's going to be wide open, controlling the boost, dumping it out through the dump pipe to the side of the car. There we go.